People like to think of art in a hierarchy, a tier list, if you will, with high art, the stuff of galleries, opera houses, and elite institutions at the top, and low art, such as TV shows, video games, and comic books, at the bottom. At the very lowest rung, you'd find advertising, commercial art, and least worthy of all, clip art. Clip art was a collection of ready-made graphics that could easily be added to documents and presentations. For decades, it was ubiquitous, but it had a reputation for being cheap and corny. As we approach the 10-year anniversary of Microsoft abandoning clip art, maybe it's time we gave it a bit more consideration. High art may be considered the pinnacle of cultural achievement, but it's low art that has a lot more to tell us about the visual culture of everyday life. In this video, we'll dive into the rise and fall of clip art and how it was shaped by not only changing taste, but also technical innovations and constraints over time. We'll take a look at 4 major shifts in technology that shaped digital clip art, from its emergence in the 1980s to its retirement in the 2010s. But before we get into that, let's briefly touch on the analog precursor to clip art as we know it. The concept of clip art predates desktop computing, but the audience for it was much more specific. In 1949, former journalist Harry Volk began selling pre-made illustrations in small 8-page booklets. He called these clip books of line art, later shortened to clip art. These booklets were extremely popular in publishing during the era of paste-up in graphic design. You could easily clip out illustrations with scissors and paste them into a magazine or advertising layout, saving time and cost compared with commissioning a unique illustration. The style of the clip art shifted from the 50s into the 1960s and 1970s, but the technical execution was always excellent. Volk wasn't the only company offering this service, but in the publishing world, the term cuts was more commonly used to describe ready-made illustrations than clip art. There was also some overlap with what were known as matte services. If you ran a small regional newspaper, you would be reliant on advertising, but local businesses were unlikely to be able to afford an advertising agency. A matte service would offer ready-made ad layouts, including illustrations, which you could simply customize with the business name and small tweaks to the copywriting. These services were the precursors to the drag-and-drop design templates that we're so familiar with today. Print publishing was big business. Before the ubiquity of screens and the internet, the newspaper industry was the best way to find out current information, and so it sustained a huge range of other industries, including commercial art. So it made sense that it was one of the first major markets for clip art. But before we dive into the transition to the personal computer, I want to take a moment to thank this video's sponsor, Envato Elements. In the 1950s, you could get Volk clipbooks by monthly subscription, but a subscription with Envato Elements will get you so much more than just illustrations. With a library over 11 million creative assets and growing, Envato Elements has everything you could need to bring your designs to life. Beyond just stock illustrations and photos, they also have video clips and templates, music and sound effects, graphics, layouts, fonts, brushes, and more, all for a single low monthly cost, totally royalty-free with unlimited downloads. I've been a user of Elements for both my videos and as a designer long before they offered to sponsor this channel. And I think what makes Envato unique is the breadth and diversity of their library. No matter what style or format I need for a particular project, I can always find something to incorporate in my design, saving valuable time, or to give me a spark of inspiration for my look and feel, be it for a social post, motion graphics for a video, or a complete presentation deck. Plus, the unlimited downloads mean I know my budget will stay under control, and the fact they're B Corp certified is a definite added bonus. So if you want to up your design game or are looking for high-quality assets for your next creative project, definitely check out Envato Elements. Big thanks to Envato Elements for supporting this channel. From here, the history of clip art in many ways is the history of desktop computers, which presents a challenge for me, since I hear there's another Linus on YouTube talking about tech. There are a lot of details and history here, so I don't want to get lost in the weeds. Instead of a fine-grained tech history, I want to take a more lo-fi approach, by only zooming in on a small set of innovations and focusing on the tech as tools. Tools that changed how people made, sold, and used clip art, and how that changed over time. In 1984, Apple released the original Macintosh. There's a great retrospective over on the MKBHD channel if you want to deep dive into that history. The important part for us here is that the Mac was a huge step forward in usability compared to earlier home computers. The mouse and graphic user interface made it easy for regular people who had maybe never used a computer before to pick up and learn in a couple of days. On this desk, we also find a key piece of hardware, a graphics tablet, which is something digital artists use to this day. Of course, now we have a lot of advanced features like pressure and tilt sensitivity, but even these early models were a huge improvement on the mouse for artists moving from traditional media. On the software side, we have MacPaint. Despite the Macintosh only displaying black and white pixels, this digital painting software laid the foundation for modern raster graphics programs. It included many interface conventions which are now universal, like the marching ants effect to indicate a selection and the lasso and paint bucket tool. Despite none of this being the first of its kind, it was the first holistic package which let artists who might not have been tech geeks create art directly on a computer. Also, the popularity of the Macintosh platform, especially in publishing and education, meant there was a viable market for clip art that people could use in lesson plans, business reports, and in presentations using early software like HyperCard. Contrast this with the failed pioneer from 1983, the VCN Execuvision, which despite having 8-bit color, sold so poorly that even though archivists have all of the separate $90 a pop clip art floppies, no copies of the original PC software remain that can open up those files. This early bitmap clip art from the Mac has a unique aesthetic. Monochrome and low resolution as it is, it's brimming with energy and more than a touch of whimsy. This was a new age of technology, and you can sense that excitement come through, even when the subject matter was mundane. A defining feature was the use of dithering, a technique using patterns of pixels to simulate shades of grey to get around that binary color limit. It all has a rustic charm to it, especially the portraits, which are fantastically imperfect. It's obvious these are illustrations and not photos. So they look a bit wonky, but that's what gives them character. It's a fascinating snapshot into how creative minds were figuring out how to use these new tools. And this pioneering digital art was only created and thus survives for us to see today because of the commercial nature of clip art. Okay, you might be thinking, that's cool, but if computers only had one color, then where did all these 1980s motion graphics come from? These days we tend to think of video as something you do with a computer, but that hasn't always been the case, and in the 1980s, film and television graphics were light years ahead of what home computers could do, thanks to industrial graphics workstations like the Quantel Paintbox. These were capable of 24-bit color graphics and came to define the look of MTV amongst other pop culture touchstones. Good luck getting your hands on one though. The Macintosh launched at under £2,000 in the UK, whereas the Quantel Paintbox cost around 80 grand, equivalent to a brand new Rolls-Royce, or around 2.5 times the average cost of a house in Britain at the time. Skip forward to the end of the 80s and we reach another turning point. Pixel art was fantastic, but it was still time-consuming to produce. An alternative would be to start with traditional media and somehow get it into the computer. While fax machines that scanned documents had been around for some time, they were never designed with the resolution and form factor for artwork. You couldn't exactly stick a painting through a fax machine, and even if you did, it would look like garbage. Flatbed scanners fixed this problem. The early models might set you back several $1,000s, But after a few years, a basic grayscale model like this had become much more affordable. The second problem was that the computers were just not that powerful yet, and high-resolution bitmaps were slow to load and ate up limited storage. The breakthrough was to convert bitmaps into vector graphics, which instead of containing data for every pixel in an image, just contained the mathematical instructions on how to draw the lines and shapes to compose it. Think of the difference in postage costs between mailing a wedding cake and mailing the written recipe. The approach doesn't work well for photos, but is perfect for stuff like logos and illustrations. The other big plus of vectors is scalability, meaning that they could be blown up or printed in high definition without pixelation. Adobe's PostScript language helped computers and printers both interpret the same instructions when it came to vector graphics, and was the catalyst for the birth of the desktop publishing industry. But that still doesn't solve how to go from scanned image to vector. While vector drawing software came shortly on the heels of bitmap programs like MacPaint, the process of manually tracing could be equally time-consuming. Autotrace, or vectorization technology, was first used by architects and cartographers for floor plans and maps. Since the input was all line drawings anyway, it was a natural starting point. It wasn't until the late 80s that vector graphic software started adopting the feature, but when they did, it seemed magical. The workflow of going from paper to scanner to vector became a major part of the clip art industry, which entered a gold rush as the 90s approached. Desktop publishing had rapidly gained traction and created a huge market for digital clip art. This period was challenging though for clip art users, since there were loads of companies with different prices, quality levels, file formats, and collections that didn't all cover the same topics. And without the internet, it was difficult to get that information in a single place. This led to different buyer's guides for clip art, which could cost you over $130 before even purchasing a single image. The styles varied widely from one company to the next, but I do want to zoom in on a particular case study from a few years later, which I believe could only have emerged during the clip art golden age. The 90s was weird. Aesthetically, there were a lot of different influences going on, so there was also a lot of wiggle room for eccentric and even grotesque styles to break into the mainstream. In clip art, the best example of this is the massive success of Art Parts by Ron and Joe. If you remember the 90s and early 2000s, you might not have heard the name, but you've definitely seen this clip art. Until I did this deep dive, I had assumed this was some kind of printmaking technique, but that didn't entirely make sense. Printmaking is way too time-consuming if you're only going to scan a single copy. It turns out it was scratchboard art, a technique that involves scratching marks onto a board with a dark coating to reveal white underneath, though clearly there was some strong influence from German expressionist printmakers. Idiosyncratic looks aside, it was the ideal art style for the technology of the time. Autotrace may have seemed like magic, but it was far from perfect. Luckily for illustrator Joe Crabtree, perfection wasn't a concern. The art itself is extremely Gen X, knowingly quirky with a postmodern, ironic sense of humor. For Ron and Joe, it seems the stars of the right style at the right time with the right technology aligned perfectly to create an unlikely mainstream hit. The Macintosh originally had a significant advantage over other PCs with its intuitive interface, but it was Microsoft who brought mouse-based computing to the masses with Windows 3.1, later building on that success with Windows 95, the first mainstream operating system to ship on CD-ROM. Today, we're surrounded by huge amounts of data. A phone with only 2 GB of storage is basically e-waste, so it can be hard to appreciate the sheer leap that CD-ROM technology was. A single CD could hold almost as much data as 500 floppy disks, with a capacity that often dwarfed hard drive sizes of early 90s computers. This gave rise to the buzzword multimedia PC and completely revolutionized software in desktop publishing and education. Extensive libraries of clip art just weren't practical on floppies, in terms of both usability and economics. The CD-ROM allowed users to browse thousands of images easily without constantly switching disks or referencing printed catalogs. At least that was the promise, because the CD-ROM unleashed an all-out clip art war of ever-inflating collections and bigger numbers. By this point, desktop publishing was so mainstream that even amateurs were getting in on the action, printing their own newsletters and greeting cards at home. With a growing user base and competition heating up, how do you stand out from the crowd? Well, for the Corel Corporation, the answer was bundling. Why purchase expensive image editing, vector graphics, and page layout software, clip art, and fonts separately when you could buy everything in one convenient package? CorelDRAW was an early mover with very capable graphics software for Windows. Aggressive pricing, frequent, if buggy, releases, and ever-inflating clip art numbers in marketing helped them to maintain market share. Corel certainly weren't the only ones in this arms race, but they were certainly one of the most successful. But that success came at a price. Clip art's image took severe damage during the clip art wars, as did Corel's reputation amongst design and publishing professionals. In the early days of Autotrace, sellers at least had the courtesy to clean up and polish the results. But when offering collections of 50,000 images, quality control was a luxury they could no longer afford. The rapid inflation also led to collections being padded out with decorative alphabets and simple cartoonish styles over more detailed artwork and useful categories of images, giving clip art a reputation for being kitsch and cheesy. The high-tech appeal of CD-ROMs quickly evaporated as people's mailboxes became flooded with free AOL trial CDs in the late 2000s. With so much competition at the bottom end of the market, clip art became dime a dozen. Cheap, low-quality shovelware. You could easily find thousands of images of clip art bundled with other shareware and digital filler given away for free on the front of computer magazines. The days when a single floppy disk of clip art cost $50 were long gone. But this fall from grace also opened up new opportunities. Clip art was now in the hands of everyday people, students, office workers, and others who found creative ways to use it beyond the realm of desktop publishing. Sure, it was still a usability nightmare. CDs solved the storage problem, but didn't fix underlying issues like incompatible file formats and the hassle of browsing through weird standalone applications. Yet something was on the horizon that would change people's experience of clip art in a major way. PowerPoint has a complex origin story. It was developed in the 80s with funding from Apple before being scooped up by Microsoft, but it wasn't until the late 90s that it really took off and became a phenomenon. By 1992, it was the best-selling presentation software on any platform. It became so ubiquitous to even become a genericized term like Kleenex or Hoover. But the real game changer for PowerPoint was the introduction of digital projectors, which were very much the Mentos to PowerPoint's Diet Coke. Before computers, presentations were made using film slides, hence slideshows, or overhead projectors. Slides were definitely more polished, but producing them was slow and expensive. You had to go to a specialized bureau to have them made. Overhead projectors were a simpler option, needing only transparencies that could be drawn on directly or later used with a photocopier or printer. However, because of their limited range, they were only really good for small groups, like in a classroom. When digital projectors came on the scene, it was a game changer. Suddenly presentations could be made anywhere, anytime. And with laptops getting lighter and more portable, it was possible to make tweaks up until the last minute, even when you were away from the office. This revolutionized not only sales presentations, but also those in education. And with that came a huge demand for visual support. Sure, people were already using third-party clip art, but Microsoft's decision to include it in the Office suite made it way more accessible and user-friendly, being only a drop-down menu away. In the late 1990s, Microsoft was riding high and had the cash to commission original clip art for the Office collection. One artist who worked for them said the rate was $100 per image, earning them $10,000 for a commission of 100 images. Nothing to sneeze at, certainly, but on the other hand, there were no royalties over time, meaning the original artist never gets paid after the initial commission. The standard of Microsoft's clip art library was top-notch. Sure, some collections weren't as polished as others, but Microsoft still did a great job in providing a wide range of art styles and covering a diverse set of different topics and scenarios. With Office being productivity software, the collection of business and office culture images was especially remarkable, offering a fascinating snapshot of office life at the turn of the millennium. The folks who used this clip art weren't just office workers and students, it was virtually everybody. So for many Gen Xers and millennials, a lot of these pieces of clip art can be powerfully nostalgic, which is an odd thing to say about something so banal and anonymous. Many of the sets and collections share a common style, some clearly inspired by historic movements in illustration, art, and design. But apart from a select few who've talked about it in public interviews, we don't know who created this art. This might be due to a non-disclosure agreement from Microsoft, or perhaps there was an element of professional embarrassment. For Generation X, who were at the core of 90s culture, there was a huge taboo against being branded a sellout, especially when it came to art. Even so, Microsoft were hardly the first to tempt artists into the dirty world of commerce. Since at least the Volk clipbooks of the 1950s, comic book artists and illustrators would draw clip art as a way to make a bit of extra cash on the side. Sadly for these unnamed artists, good times don't last forever, and in 2014, following years of neglect, Microsoft removed clip art from the Office suite. Many articles declaring it to be the death of clip art, marking the end of an era. By the early 2010s, broadband became more accessible, and the availability of cheap and good digital SLR cameras unleashed a tsunami of amateur digital photographers. This led to a massive disruption of the stock photo industry, which had traditionally been very expensive and the sole domain of major companies who could afford the high prices. Sites like iStockPhoto began the trend of microstock, which offered images crowdsourced from photographers around the world for much cheaper prices, or even free. After being so overused, people were ready for a change from clip art, but stock photos were also more up-to-date, easier to search, and covered more scenarios. While stock photography became the default, not every concept can be photographed, especially as more things became digital and thus intangible. Stock photos of server racks, hard drives, and actual clouds are neither visually compelling nor very helpful. It's little wonder then that tech companies were amongst the first to re-embrace illustration. In 2017, Facebook launched a new illustration style called Allegria. It was characterized by bright colors, simple geometric forms, and human figures with exaggerated proportions and non-representational skin tones. This was meant to project a friendly and inclusive image. But regardless of whether it helped Facebook's reputation, the illustration style was extremely popular and endlessly copied, mostly by other tech companies. As it grew in popularity, people began to call it corporate Memphis, or simply the corporate art style. Stock illustrators found it easy to produce and sell. It became a go-to for many companies who could never afford custom illustration. It was also easy to manipulate and customize for designers who lacked drawing skills compared with more detailed and realistic styles. This raises some interesting questions. For one, is clip art actually dead, or does it just go by a different name? In the newspaper era, it was called cuts, and now it's called stock illustration. The tools and distribution methods may have changed, but the basic concept is the same: ready-made illustrations for commercial use. There's also been a growing backlash against the corporate Memphis style, with many critics calling it soulless trash. But do people actually hate this art, or just the companies it represents? As philosopher Slavoj Žižek said, "You don't hate Mondays, you hate capitalism." If big tech companies had adopted a different style, would it still provoke the same vitriol in people? Another question to consider is whether it's fair to judge what is essentially clip art by the standards of fine art. Just because they're both visual expressions doesn't mean they're intended for the same purpose. Clip art has a very specific commercial purpose, to amplify a message, regardless of the value of that message, whether it's an anti-littering campaign, a Black Friday sale, or a pitch for crypto-enabled smart toilets. We don't experience it like fine art. It's not meant to evoke personal emotions or comment on the human experience. So then, can art without a soul still have value? I believe that yes, it can. Commercial art reflects our society in a different, more collective way, both the good and the bad. In a capitalist society, of course, it reflects our consumer aspirations, but also our unconscious attitudes and values. Take, for example, the hand-drawn commercial illustrations of mid-century advertising. Visually gorgeous and technically flawless, but they were also often filled with sexist and racist tropes. As for today's corporate Memphis style, the latest iteration of clip art, who knows what people with the benefit of hindsight will see reflected about our moment in history. An age of tech giants projecting a colorful, friendly image while also exploiting people and profiting off our social division and environmental destruction? Probably. But also an age when people felt alienated by technology that was supposed to bring us together. But still, we yearned for an authentic connection. That's not a unique vision of a lone artist, but a shared experience felt by all of us and expressed even in the lowest form of art. And in that way, it's kind of remarkable what can be gleaned by digging through the trash. That's it for my deep dive into the rise and fall and rise again of clip art. A special thanks to my patrons over on Patreon who support me to continue making videos like this. You can join them for as little as $1 a month, and it really makes a huge difference in keeping this channel going. If that ending was just a little bit too heavy for you, I suggest you check out this video. It's one of the least watched on the channel, but I think it's a lot of fun, where I redesign a whiskey label from a popular Japanese video game franchise. My name is Linus, thank you for watching, and I hope I'll see you in a future video.